The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the Metro City Police Department as Officer Blake stepped out of his patrol car. At 42 years old, he carried himself with the kind of swagger that came from 15 years of wearing a badge. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his attitude firmly planted in the belief that he was untouchable. Blake had learned early in his career that connections mattered more than conduct. His uncle had been a sergeant. His brother-in-law worked in internal affairs, and he'd made sure to befriend all the right people over the years. This network had protected him through several complaints that might have ended another officer's career. Each time, the investigations quietly disappeared into filing cabinets, and Blake continued his patrol with even more confidence that he could do whatever he wanted. His fellow officers had mixed feelings about him. Some genuinely liked his confident personality and the way he never backed down from any situation. Others stayed quiet about his behavior because they didn't want to rock the boat. A few had tried to speak up over the years, but when nothing changed and their own careers started facing obstacles, they learned to look the other way. Blake's patrol route took him through the downtown area, where he particularly enjoyed making his presence known. He had strong opinions about who belonged in certain neighborhoods and who didn't. These opinions often influenced how he interacted with different people during traffic stops, street encounters, and even casual conversations. He'd developed a talent for staying just within the legal boundaries while making his prejudices clear, through his tone, body language, and choice of words. On this particular morning, Blake was feeling especially confident. He'd just received word that his latest complaint had been dismissed without investigation. A local business owner had accused him of harassment, but the paperwork had mysteriously gotten lost somewhere in the bureaucratic maze. Blake knew his connections had worked their magic once again. Meanwhile, across town, Detective Chief Rivera was preparing for one of the most important assignments of her career. At 35, she had already made a name for herself as one of the most thorough and fair investigators in the region. Her colleagues respected her not just for her rank, but for the way she'd earned it through genuine hard work and dedication to justice. Rivera had grown up in a working-class family, where both her parents had taught her the value of treating everyone with respect, regardless of their background. Her father had been a mechanic, her mother a school teacher, and both had instilled in her a strong sense of right and wrong. When she decided to become a police officer, her parents had been proud but worried. They knew the challenges she would face as a woman of color in law enforcement. Over the years, Rivera had proven herself time and again. She'd solved complex cases that others had given up on, built trust in communities that had long been suspicious of police, and mentored dozens of young officers who now carried forward her values of fairness and integrity. Her reputation had spread beyond her own department, which is how she'd ended up with this particular assignment. For weeks, Rivera's department had been receiving complaints about misconduct in Metro City's police force. The reports painted a picture of officers who believed they were above the law, particularly when dealing with minority communities. Phone calls, emails, and formal complaints had piled up, but somehow none of them seemed to result in any disciplinary action. The mayor of Metro City had finally reached out to Rivera's department for help. He was facing pressure from community groups and needed an outside investigation to determine if the complaints had merit. Rivera had volunteered for the undercover operation immediately. She understood that sometimes the only way to see the truth was to experience it firsthand. Rivera spent hours preparing for her undercover role. She studied the area, memorized street names and local landmarks, and carefully chose her appearance. She selected casual clothes that would help her blend in with the general public: a worn denim jacket, comfortable jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. She pulled her hair back in a simple ponytail and removed the expensive watch that marked her professional status. Looking at herself in the mirror, Rivera saw exactly what she'd intended. She appeared to be just another young woman going about her daily business. The transformation was so complete that even her own mother might not recognize her at first glance. This anonymity was exactly what she needed to observe how officers really behaved when they thought no one important was watching. Rivera's plan was simple but thorough. She would spend several days in different parts of the city, observing police interactions with the public. She would visit local businesses, walk through neighborhoods, and position herself where she could witness how officers conducted themselves during routine activities. Her goal wasn't to entrap anyone, but simply to observe and document the reality of police behavior in Metro City. She carried a small recording device hidden in her jacket and had a backup camera in her bag. Everything she documented would be carefully preserved as evidence. Rivera understood that this investigation could have serious consequences for officers who were found to be violating their oath. But she also knew that protecting the public from abuse of power was one of her most important responsibilities. As Rivera drove toward Metro City that morning, she thought about the complaints she'd read. Stories of unnecessary aggression, discriminatory treatment, and officers who seemed to forget that they were public servants, not rulers. Some of the reports were heartbreaking. Elderly citizens humiliated during traffic stops, young people treated as criminals for simply walking in their own neighborhoods, and business owners intimidated for asking reasonable questions. Rivera had seen enough corruption and abuse in her career to know that these problems rarely existed in isolation. When one officer felt comfortable mistreating the public, it usually meant that the entire culture of the department had problems. Either supervisors were actively encouraging bad behavior, or they were failing to address it when it occurred. The drive to Metro City gave Rivera time to mentally prepare herself for what she might witness. She had investigated police misconduct before, but going undercover was different. She would have to resist every instinct to intervene when she saw wrongdoing. Instead, she would have to document everything quietly and trust that justice would come later through proper channels. Rivera knew that her investigation might uncover behavior that would be difficult to watch. Officers who had forgotten that every person they encountered was someone's parent, child, or sibling. She steeled herself for the possibility that she might witness the kind of treatment that eroded public trust in law enforcement and made her own job more difficult. As she pulled into a parking space near the Metro City downtown area, Rivera took a deep breath and reminded herself why this work mattered. Every officer who abused their power made it harder for good officers to build relationships with the communities they served. Every act of discrimination or unnecessary aggression created wounds that took years to heal. Rivera stepped out of her car and began walking toward the coffee shop, where she planned to start her observations. She had no way of knowing that within hours, she would come face to face with exactly the kind of behavior that had prompted this investigation. The morning that had started so normally was about to become a defining moment in both her career and the career of Officer Blake. Rivera pushed open the glass door of Tony's Coffee Corner, a small local shop that sat directly across from the Metro City Police Department. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered, and the rich smell of freshly brewed coffee filled her senses. She had chosen this location carefully after studying the area for weeks. According to her research, many officers stopped here during their breaks, making it the perfect spot to observe their behavior when they thought they were off duty. The coffee shop had that comfortable, lived-in feeling that made people want to linger. Mismatched chairs surrounded small wooden tables, local artwork hung on the walls, and soft jazz played in the background. Rivera noticed that most of the customers seemed to be regulars. They chatted easily with Tony, the owner, who worked behind the counter with practiced efficiency. Rivera ordered a simple coffee and found a corner table that gave her a clear view of both the entrance and the police station across the street. She pulled out a worn paperback novel and positioned it so she could observe while appearing to read. Her recording device was already activated, hidden in the inner pocket of her jacket. For the first hour, Rivera watched normal interactions between officers and civilians. She saw a female officer help an elderly man with directions, witnessed another officer buying coffee for a homeless veteran, and observed generally polite exchanges. These positive interactions reminded her why she had chosen law enforcement as her career. Most officers genuinely wanted to serve their communities, but Rivera knew from the complaints that not all the officers in this department shared those values. She settled in to wait, understanding that investigations required patience. Sometimes the truth only revealed itself when people thought no one was watching. Around 10:30, Rivera noticed increased activity across the street. Several patrol cars had returned to the station, and she could see officers moving around inside the building. She checked her watch and realized this was probably the time when the morning shift took their coffee breaks. Sure enough, within minutes the coffee shop door opened and two uniformed officers walked in. Rivera recognized one of them immediately from the photos in his personnel file. Officer Blake looked exactly like his picture, tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of confident stride that suggested he owned whatever space he entered. Blake's partner was younger, probably in his late 20s, and seemed nervous around his more experienced colleague. Rivera had read about Officer Chen in the case files. He had only been on the force for 2 years and had no complaints against him. Several witnesses had mentioned that he often looked uncomfortable during Blake's interactions with the public, but he had never spoken up. "Tony, the usual," Blake called out as he approached the counter, not bothering with pleasantries like please or thank you. His voice carried across the small shop, and Rivera noticed how other customers seemed to tense slightly at his presence. "Coming right up, Officer Blake," Tony replied, his tone polite but noticeably cooler than it had been with other customers. While waiting for their order, Blake began talking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You know what's wrong with this neighborhood, Chen? Too many people who think they don't have to follow the rules. They see this badge and think they can challenge us instead of showing proper respect." Rivera kept her eyes on her book, but listened carefully. Blake's tone suggested he was the kind of person who enjoyed having an audience for his opinions. I mean, look around," Blake continued, gesturing broadly at the coffee shop in the street beyond. "Half these people probably don't even belong in this part of town. They come down here thinking they own the place, causing problems for decent, hard-working citizens." Chen shifted uncomfortably and mumbled something that Rivera couldn't quite hear. Blake either didn't notice his partner's discomfort or chose to ignore it. "The problem is that nobody teaches respect anymore," Blake went on. "In my day, people knew their place. They understood that when an officer tells you to do something, you do it without question. Now everyone thinks they're a lawyer or a civil rights activist." Rivera felt her jaw tighten but forced herself to remain calm. This was exactly the kind of attitude that the complaints had described. Blake was revealing his mindset clearly, showing that he saw policing as about power and control rather than service and protection. Tony called their names, and both officers moved to collect their drinks. Blake had ordered a large iced coffee, while Chen had chosen something smaller and simpler. As they turned to leave, Rivera made her move. She had been waiting for the right moment to create a natural interaction that would test Blake's behavior. Rivera stood up from her table, timing it so that she would need to walk past the officers to reach the counter area, where napkins and sugar were kept. The coffee shop layout meant that the narrow space between tables created a natural bottleneck. Rivera moved slowly, giving Blake plenty of room to pass, but the officer seemed to take her presence as some kind of personal affront. "Excuse me," Rivera said politely as she reached for napkins from the dispenser. Blake had been in the middle of another loud comment about people not knowing their place when Rivera's movement caught his attention. He stopped mid-sentence and stared at her with obvious irritation. "Watch where you're going," he said sharply, even though Rivera had been careful not to interfere with his path. "I'm sorry," Rivera replied calmly, genuinely puzzled by his aggressive tone. "I was just getting napkins." Something about her response seemed to trigger Blake's anger. Maybe it was that she had spoken back instead of simply apologizing and moving away. Maybe it was that other customers were watching the interaction. Or maybe it was simply that Rivera represented everything Blake disliked about people he considered beneath his authority. "You people always have an excuse," Blake said, his voice rising. "Always got something to say instead of just doing what you're told." The coffee shop went quiet. Even the jazz music seemed to fade into the background as other customers realized they were witnessing something uncomfortable. Tony looked up from behind the counter with concern, and Chen's face showed clear embarrassment at his partner's behavior. Rivera felt her training kick in. Every instinct told her to identify herself, to use her authority to shut down Blake's inappropriate conduct. But she was here as an investigator, not as a fellow officer. She needed to see how far Blake would take this behavior when he thought he was dealing with a powerless civilian. I'm not sure what you mean, Rivera said carefully, keeping her voice level and respectful. I was just trying to get napkins without getting in your way. Blake stepped closer, using his size and uniform to intimidate. Don't play dumb with me. You saw me coming and decided to get in my path anyway. That's disrespectful to a police officer. Rivera could smell the coffee on Blake's breath as he moved into her personal space. She noticed Chen looking increasingly uncomfortable, but making no move to intervene. The other customers were watching with a mixture of shock and fear, uncertain whether they should intervene or stay out of it. Officer, I really wasn't trying to cause any problem, Rivera said, maintaining her calm demeanor despite Blake's aggressive posture. I can move if you need more space. But Blake had clearly decided that Rivera's polite responses were somehow an insult to his authority. His face reddened with anger, and Rivera could see that he was working himself up to something more serious than verbal intimidation. You know what your problem is? Blake said, his voice dripping with contempt. You don't understand that when you see this uniform you show respect. Instead, you act like you belong anywhere you want to be. Without warning, Blake deliberately tilted his large iced coffee and poured the entire contents over Rivera's head and shoulders. The cold liquid soaked through her jacket and shirt, dripping onto the floor and creating a puddle around her feet. The coffee shop erupted in gasps and shocked murmurs. Tony started to move from behind the counter, but Blake's glare stopped him in his tracks. Chen looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Now clean that up, Blake commanded, pointing at the mess he had created. And next time, maybe you'll think twice about disrespecting a police officer. Rivera stood completely still for a moment, coffee dripping from her hair and soaking through her clothes. The cold liquid had shocked her system, but her mind remained crystal clear. Every eye in the coffee shop was focused on her, waiting to see how she would respond to this obvious abuse of power. The silence stretched for several seconds. Blake stood with his arms crossed, a satisfied smirk on his face, clearly expecting Rivera to scramble for napkins and apologize profusely. His partner Chen looked mortified but remained frozen in place, apparently too intimidated to challenge his senior officer. Instead of reaching for napkins, Rivera calmly pulled her phone from her pocket. The device had been protected by her jacket and was still dry. She opened the camera app and began recording, holding the phone at chest level where Blake could clearly see what she was doing. What's your name and badge number, officer? Rivera asked in a steady voice that carried throughout the now silent coffee shop. Blake's smirk disappeared instantly. What did you just say to me? I asked for your name and badge number, Rivera repeated, her tone remaining perfectly calm and professional. I'd like to file a complaint about this incident. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Blake's face flushed red with anger, and Rivera could see a vein pulsing in his forehead. He clearly wasn't used to anyone challenging him, especially someone he viewed as powerless. You think you can record me? Blake snarled, taking a step closer to Rivera. You think you have the right to demand anything from a police officer? Every citizen has the right to know an officer's identification when filing a complaint, Rivera replied evenly. It's standard procedure. Behind the counter, Tony had pulled out his own phone and was discreetly recording the interaction. Several other customers had done the same, creating multiple angles of documentation. Rivera noticed this with satisfaction but kept her focus on Blake. Blake's anger was building to dangerous levels. Turn that phone off right now or I'll arrest you for interfering with police business. I'm not interfering with anything, Rivera said calmly. I'm standing in a coffee shop, soaked in coffee that you deliberately poured on me, asking for your identification so I can file a complaint. That's my legal right as a citizen. Chen finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Blake, maybe we should just go. Blake whipped around to glare at his partner. Don't tell me how to do my job, rookie. This person needs to learn some respect for authority. Rivera watched the interaction carefully. Chen's discomfort was obvious and she could see that he knew his partner's behavior was wrong. But fear and inexperience kept him from taking any meaningful action to stop it. Officer Blake, Rivera said, having caught his name when Chen spoke. Blake what? What's your full name and badge number? The fact that she now had his name seemed to enrage Blake even further. You don't get to make demands of me. You're nobody. Just another troublemaker who thinks she knows her rights. Rivera raised an eyebrow at his choice of words. So your position is that citizens don't have rights when interacting with police officers? My position is that people like you need to show respect instead of causing problems, Blake shot back, his voice rising with each word. People like me? Rivera asked quietly. What exactly do you mean by that? Blake realized he had walked into dangerous territory, but his anger overrode his caution. You know exactly what I mean. People who come into decent neighborhoods looking for trouble. People who think they can challenge authority instead of doing what they're told. The coffee shop customers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Blake's meaning was crystal clear to everyone present, even though he was trying to avoid explicitly stating his prejudices. Rivera kept recording, her phone capturing not just Blake's words but his aggressive body language and the fear on Chen's face. I see. So in your opinion, I don't belong in this neighborhood? I didn't say that. Blake backpedaled weakly. Then what did you mean? Rivera pressed gently. Blake's frustration boiled over. Stop trying to twist my words. You're the one causing problems here. You got in my way, you're being disrespectful, and now you're trying to make this about something it's not. Rivera glanced around the coffee shop. Would anyone here like to share what they witnessed? Did I get in this officer's way? An elderly woman near the window spoke up in a shaky voice. No, dear. You were just getting napkins. You didn't do anything wrong. She's lying, Blake exploded. You can't trust these people to tell the truth. The room went completely silent. Blake had finally said what everyone knew he was thinking. His prejudices were now on full display for everyone to see and record. Rivera's voice remained calm. These people? Could you clarify what you mean by that? Blake realized he had crossed a line that even his protection network might not be able to cover up. But instead of backing down, he doubled down on his aggression. I mean troublemakers who come looking for confrontations with police officers, he said. But everyone could hear the weakness in his excuse. Rivera noticed Chen slowly backing toward the door, clearly wanting to distance himself from his partner's behavior. The young officer's face showed genuine horror at what he was witnessing. Officer Blake, I'm going to ask you one more time for your badge number, Rivera said. If you refuse to provide it, I'll be forced to contact your supervisor directly. Blake's eyes narrowed dangerously. Are you threatening me? I'm informing you of the proper procedure for filing a complaint, Rivera replied. Which is what I intend to do. Blake pulled out his radio with exaggerated movements. Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I need backup at Tony's Coffee Corner. I have an aggressive individual who's being non-compliant and interfering with police business. Rivera raised an eyebrow. How exactly am I being aggressive or non-compliant? I'm standing still, speaking calmly, and asking for information that you're legally required to provide. You're recording without permission and making threatening statements, Blake said into his radio. Recording is legal in public spaces, Rivera pointed out, and asking for your badge number isn't a threat. Within minutes, 2 more patrol cars arrived outside the coffee shop. Rivera could see officers getting out and walking toward the entrance. She noticed that some of the coffee shop customers were nervously gathering their belongings, not wanting to get involved in what was clearly escalating into a larger incident. Tony stepped out from behind the counter. Officers, I want you to know that this young lady didn't do anything wrong. She was just getting napkins when Officer Blake poured coffee on her deliberately. Blake rounded on the shop owner. Stay out of this, Tony. You don't know what you're talking about. I saw exactly what happened, Tony insisted, his voice gaining strength. Everyone here saw it. The backup officers entered the coffee shop, looking confused by the scene they found. One of them, an older sergeant with graying hair, immediately took in the situation. Rivera standing soaked in coffee, Blake red-faced and agitated, Chen looking like he wanted to disappear, and multiple civilians with their phones out recording. What's going on here? The sergeant asked. his tone suggesting he already suspected this wasn't a routine call. Blake launched into his version of events. This individual was being disruptive and disrespectful. When I asked her to move, she became aggressive and started making threats. She's been recording without permission and refusing to comply with lawful orders. The sergeant looked at Rivera, who was still calmly holding her phone. "Ma'am, is that your version of what happened?" Rivera smiled slightly. "Not exactly, officer. Would you like to see the recording? It shows the entire incident from the beginning." Blake stepped forward aggressively. "She doesn't have the right to record police officers. I want her arrested for interference and disorderly conduct." The sergeant held up a hand to stop Blake's rant. "Let's all calm down and figure out what really happened here." He looked around the coffee shop, noting the multiple witnesses and their expressions. Something about the whole situation didn't add up, and his years of experience told him there was more to this story than Blake was telling. Sergeant Davis had been a police officer for 22 years, and his experience told him something was seriously wrong with this situation. The scene in front of him didn't match Blake's dramatic radio call about an aggressive suspect. Instead, he saw a young woman standing calmly in coffee-soaked clothes, multiple witnesses with their phones out, and Blake looking more agitated than anyone else in the room. "Let me understand this correctly," Sergeant Davis said slowly, his eyes moving between Blake and Rivera. "You're telling me that this woman was being so disruptive that you needed backup, but she's just standing there asking for your badge number?" Blake's jaw tightened. "She was interfering with police business and being disrespectful to a uniformed officer. She refuses to follow lawful orders." "What lawful orders?" Rivera asked calmly. "You told me to clean up the coffee that you deliberately poured on me. Is that a lawful order?" Sergeant Davis raised an eyebrow. "You poured coffee on her?" "She got in my way," Blake said defensively. "It was an accident." Tony stepped forward from behind the counter. "That's not true, Sergeant. I saw the whole thing. Officer Blake deliberately poured his entire cup of coffee over her head because she asked him to be more careful with his language about the neighborhood." "I never said that," Blake protested. The elderly woman by the window spoke up again. "Oh yes, you did, dear. You were talking very loudly about people not knowing their place. Then when this young lady politely asked for napkins, you got angry and poured coffee all over her." Rivera noticed that more backup officers had arrived and were now standing in the doorway, watching the interaction with growing concern. Chen, Blake's partner, had moved as far away from Blake as possible and was staring at the floor. "Ma'am," Sergeant Davis addressed Rivera directly, "would you mind telling me your version of what happened?" "Of course," Rivera replied. "I was sitting at that table reading when Officer Blake arrived. He made several loud comments about people in this neighborhood not knowing their place and needing to show proper respect to authority. When I got up to get napkins, he accused me of getting in his way deliberately. When I apologized and tried to explain, he became increasingly aggressive and finally poured his coffee on me intentionally." Blake laughed bitterly. "And you believe her over a police officer? She's obviously trying to cause trouble." Sergeant Davis looked around the room. "Actually, I'd like to hear from the witnesses." "Sir," he pointed to Tony. "What exactly did you see?" Tony took a deep breath. "Officer Blake was talking very loudly about people not belonging in this neighborhood. He used phrases like people like that and knowing their place. When the young lady got up for napkins, he started yelling at her even though she was being perfectly polite. Then he deliberately tilted his cup and poured the whole thing on her head." "That's a lie," Blake shouted. "You can't trust these people. They stick together against police officers." The room went dead silent. Even the backup officers exchanged uncomfortable glances at Blake's choice of words. Sergeant Davis's expression hardened. "Officer Blake, I think you need to calm down and think carefully about what you're saying." But Blake was beyond rational thought. The stress of being challenged in front of witnesses had pushed him over the edge. "I'm telling you, Sergeant, people like her come into neighborhoods like this looking for trouble. They want to create incidents so they can file complaints and get attention." Rivera had heard enough. Blake had revealed his true character completely, and she had more than enough evidence for her investigation. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. flipping it open to reveal her credentials. "Detective Chief Rivera, Regional Police Authority," she said clearly, holding up her badge and identification for everyone to see. The coffee shop erupted in gasps and surprised murmurs. Several customers moved closer to get a better look at her credentials, but the most dramatic reaction came from the police officers. Chen's mouth fell open in shock. The backup officers straightened up immediately, recognizing the authority that Rivera's rank represented, and Sergeant Davis stepped back as if he'd been physically struck. But Blake's reaction was the most extreme. His face went completely white, then flushed deep red. His mouth opened and closed several times without any sound coming out, like a fish gasping for air. "You're lying," Blake finally whispered. "That's fake. You're impersonating a police officer." Rivera calmly handed her credentials to Sergeant Davis, who examined them carefully. His face grew more serious with each detail he verified. "These are genuine," Sergeant Davis announced to the room. "Detective Chief Rivera is a senior law enforcement official from the Regional Police Authority." The backup officers immediately removed their hats in a gesture of respect. Chen looked like he was about to be sick, and Blake continued to stare at Rivera as if she had materialized from another dimension. "Chief Rivera," Sergeant Davis said formally, "I apologize for this incident. If we had known—" Rivera held up a hand to stop him. "Sergeant, that's exactly the problem. Officer Blake didn't treat me poorly because he didn't know my rank. He treated me poorly because of who he thought I was. His behavior would have been unacceptable regardless of my position." She turned to address Blake directly. "Officer Blake, you poured coffee on me because you thought I was powerless to do anything about it. You made assumptions about who I was, based on my appearance, and felt entitled to humiliate me because you believed I had no recourse." Blake finally found his voice, but it came out as a desperate plea. "Chief, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know who you were. If I had known—" "That's exactly my point," Rivera interrupted. "You should treat every citizen with the same respect you would show a superior officer. The badge gives you authority to enforce the law, not to intimidate and abuse people." Sergeant Davis was looking through Rivera's credentials more carefully. "Chief, what brings you to Metro City? Are you here in an official capacity?" Rivera nodded. "I'm conducting an investigation into complaints of police misconduct in this department. This encounter was part of that investigation." Blake's legs seemed to give out, and he stumbled backward until he hit the wall. "An investigation? But I didn't know. This isn't fair. You were undercover." "Officer Blake," Rivera said firmly, "I was simply sitting in a coffee shop dressed in casual clothes. Your reaction to a citizen asking for your badge number tells me everything I need to know about how you view your role as a police officer." Chen finally spoke up, his voice shaking. "Chief Rivera, I want you to know that I don't agree with my partner's behavior. I should have spoken up, but I was afraid to challenge a senior officer." Rivera looked at the young officer with understanding. "Officer Chen, I've read your file. You have a clean record and good evaluations, but silence in the face of misconduct makes you complicit. Police officers have a duty to protect citizens from abuse, even when that abuse comes from fellow officers." Tony stepped forward with a tablet in his hands. "Chief Rivera, I want you to know that everything was recorded by our security cameras. The whole incident is documented from multiple angles." Rivera smiled for the first time since the incident began. "Thank you, Tony. That will be very helpful for the investigation." Blake pushed himself off the wall and took a step toward Rivera, his hands clasped together in a pleading gesture. "Chief, please, I have 15 years on the force. I have a family, a mortgage. I can't lose my job over a misunderstanding." Rivera's expression remained firm but professional. "Officer Blake, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate abuse of power caught on multiple cameras and witnessed by numerous civilians. You revealed your true character when you thought you were dealing with someone who couldn't fight back." Sergeant Davis stepped forward. "Chief Rivera, what would you like us to do?" Rivera looked around the coffee shop at all the witnesses, then back at Blake, who was now sweating profusely despite the cool morning air. "I'd like Officer Blake suspended immediately pending a full investigation," she said. "And I'll need to speak with your captain about the broader issues in this department. Within 2 hours of the coffee shop incident, Blake found himself sitting in Captain Rodriguez's office, his badge and gun already confiscated. The captain had arrived at the station to find Chief Rivera waiting in the lobby, still wearing her coffee-stained clothes and carrying a tablet full of video evidence that would change everything. Captain Rodriguez had been with Metro City Police for 18 years, working his way up through the ranks. He prided himself on running a clean department, but as he watched the security footage from Tony's coffee corner, he realized that serious problems had been hiding right under his nose. "Blake, I've seen the videos," Captain Rodriguez said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Multiple angles, multiple witnesses, and audio that clearly shows your behavior. What do you have to say for yourself?" Blake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His earlier desperation had been replaced by a different strategy: denial and deflection. "Captain, you know me. 15 years of service, commendations, clean record. This is being blown out of proportion." "Clean record?" Captain Rodriguez pulled out a thick file folder. "Blake, I've been looking through your complaint history. Do you know what I found?" Blake's face paled slightly. "Those complaints were all dismissed. Internal affairs cleared me every time." "That's what concerns me," the captain replied. 7 complaints in 5 years, all mysteriously dismissed without proper investigation. Chief Rivera has been very enlightening about how those dismissals happened. Meanwhile, in another part of the building, Rivera was meeting with internal affairs investigators and reviewing Blake's complete personnel file. What she found painted a disturbing picture of systematic misconduct that had been covered up for years. Detective Williams from Internal Affairs looked up from the documents. "Chief Rivera, we're finding a pattern here. Blake's complaints always seem to disappear into bureaucratic dead ends. Phone calls were made, files were mislabeled, witnesses became unavailable." Rivera nodded grimly. "That's exactly what we suspected. Blake didn't operate in isolation. He had protection from someone higher up the chain." As news of Blake's suspension spread through the department, something unexpected began happening. Officers who had remained silent for years started coming forward with their own stories about Blake's behavior. Officer Martinez, a 10-year veteran, knocked on Captain Rodriguez's door that afternoon. "Captain, I need to tell you about some incidents I witnessed with Blake. I should have reported them years ago, but I was told it wouldn't make any difference." "What kind of incidents?" the captain asked. "Traffic stops that went too far, searches without proper cause, language that crossed the line. I saw Blake humiliate people who couldn't fight back, and when I tried to speak up, I was told to mind my own business or face consequences." Similar conversations were happening throughout the building. The incident at the coffee shop had broken a dam of silence that had protected Blake for too long. By the end of the first day, Internal Affairs had received statements from 8 fellow officers detailing misconduct they had witnessed. But more importantly, civilians began calling with their own stories. Rivera spent the next morning at the community center, meeting with people who had experienced Blake's abuse firsthand. The stories were heartbreaking and remarkably consistent. Mrs. Johnson, a 70-year-old retired teacher, described being pulled over for a minor traffic violation and subjected to 20 minutes of humiliation because she had asked Blake to explain the reason for the stop. A young college student named Kevin told Rivera about being searched and detained for 2 hours while walking home from work, simply because Blake decided he looked suspicious in his own neighborhood. Tony from the coffee shop revealed that Blake had been making inappropriate comments about customers for months, but Tony had been afraid to complain because he depended on police protection for his business. Each story added weight to Rivera's investigation and painted a picture of an officer who had forgotten that his job was to serve and protect, not intimidate and control. Meanwhile, Blake was desperately trying to save his career. He contacted every connection he had, calling in favors and seeking intervention from the network that had protected him before. But times had changed. The incident with Rivera had been too public, too well documented, and too serious for anyone to sweep under the rug. Blake's phone calls were met with uncomfortable silences and polite refusals to get involved. His union representative, Attorney Foster, was blunt during their meeting. Blake, I've seen the evidence. Multiple videos, witness statements, and now, your own colleagues are coming forward. The best I can do is negotiate a resignation instead of termination. But what about my pension? Blake asked desperately. I'm only 5 years from retirement. That's probably gone too, Foster replied sadly. Chief Rivera is talking about criminal charges, assault, violation of civil rights, abuse of power under color of law. You're looking at serious federal charges, not just losing your job. The investigation moved quickly because the evidence was overwhelming. Rivera's hidden recording device had captured not just Blake's actions, but his explicit statements about who belonged in certain neighborhoods and who deserved respect. Federal investigators became involved when River,